Okay, this video is about how to reduce the risk of seizures, let's say either after a first seizure or in the context of epilepsy. It started because a lady who's a friend of mine told me that one of her girlfriends had a son who had a benign brain tumor and had a seizure. Okay, and what could they do to reduce the likelihood of that recurring? Okay, so I'm going to do this in 4 parts because it's a little bit of a long lecture to do all at once. I'll start out by going over normal neural anatomy, so because you have to know a little bit about that to make sense of stuff, and then I'll start going into all these different causes of seizure that can be reduced. And I do think this is a very useful lecture because what is told by neurologists and is in the conventional books, I think, is limited to the number of things a person can do for themselves. So we're going to go through all that. We got to go through a little bit of basic neurophysiology, how neurons work. So here's the primary, initial neuron. Incoming information comes from the dendrites. Dendrite means like dendron, like a tree. So incoming information, if this neuron gets activated, it'll fire an action potential beginning at the axon hillock, travels down the axon to the axon terminal, and then the neurotransmitter will be activated to travel to the synaptic cleft. It merges with it, releases its neurotransmitters. They diffuse across the cleft, activate the postsynaptic neuron. This is myelin, the yellow stuff, a special type of fat. And the sodium channels that will be located here will have the action potential. Its conduction jumps between these lumps of fat. It's called saltatory, to jump conduction. The intervening spots without the myelin are nodes of Ranvier. You don't need to know all this stuff, but if you're going to read about it, you're going to come across all these terms. Mitochondria are producing a lot of ATP. The cell body's up here. There's the nucleus and the cell body's in here. The DNA is in here. This whole thing is a cell body. Okay, here's just a little more detail. Sodium channels depolarize a neuron, meaning that because the positive charge comes into it, so now its membrane potential becomes more positive. This travels down the axon. Once it reaches the axon terminal, you have voltage-gated calcium channels that open up. The key point is that calcium comes into the cell, and it's the elevated cytoplasm calcium that activates the neurotransmitter vesicles to travel to the synaptic cleft. That's an important point. Elevated cytoplasm calcium. That's going to come up over and over again. Okay, so one of the key things to understand about activation of a nerve is that it all comes down to calcium. And just like the old saying, all roads lead to Rome, in a neuron, it's all about calcium. And lots of things lead to increased cytoplasm calcium. Okay, and there's normal physiology, like when you're active, you'll have increased cytoplasm calcium. When you're trying to learn something, you'll have increased cytoplasm calcium. But there's lots of bad things that'll do it as well. Lack of blood flow, SERCA inhibitors, endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum calciumase, mitochondrial inhibitors will lead to this. Traumatic brain injury, cell phone Wi-Fi EMF, the whole no pathway like a Martin Pall. Excessive psychological stress, that's a big one. Sleep deprivation, that's a common one. Caffeine does as well. Excitotoxins, things like MSG, MFG, aspartame, GP. Aspartate, some stimulants, and that's just plain old glutamate. Okay, leaky gums will increase the risk of this as well. We're not going to get into all that right now, but there's a lot of things that activate it. Okay, so a little bit more about what is excitotoxicity all about. Here's another synapse in more detail. So here you've got the voltage-gated calcium channels opened up, letting calcium into the cell, causing the glutamate in the neurotransmitter vesicles, travel to the plasma membrane, the release by exocytosis into the plasma membrane, through the plasma membrane into the synaptic cleft. And then the glutamate travels to the postsynaptic neuron. It first opens up the AMPA channels for sodium. That depolarizes the cell, making its membrane potential more positive. When its membrane potential becomes more positive, the magnesium that had been sitting in the NMDA receptor is now going to pop out of there because there's no longer a highly negative charge for its 2+ charge to be attracted to. And now calcium channels can flow through here. So a couple important points I make is most Americans, the vast majority of them, are magnesium deficient because they don't eat enough plants. So eat more plants, you'll have more magnesium. Magnesium blocks the NMDA receptor for glutamate, making it less active, so it blocks calcium from getting into the postsynaptic neuron. That's what you want. So one of the things a patient who's worried about having a seizure, recurrent seizure, could do is make sure they've got adequate magnesium. Magnesium's located in the center of chlorophyll, so you just eat your plants, you'll get your magnesium. If you want to supplement, there's things you can do. We're not going to get into that though, but you get pretty good magnesium just eating plants, okay? That's an important point. You want to decrease the excitability of the NMDA receptor. Also relevant is to note that GP, glyphosate, I like to call it glycine phosphate, but glyphosate is the official name, that also binds to the NMDA receptor and can activate it. So that's another reason why you want to eat organic, so you avoid that stuff. Okay, you want to avoid aspartame. You can get ASP, aspartate. That also contributes to increasing the activity, the excitability of the NMDA receptor for glutamate. Also, well, we'll come back to beta amyloid protein later, but that can become relevant. We'll talk about that later. But anyways, if you overstimulate this postsynaptic neuron too much, it can go into what's called excitotoxicity. It means you stimulate it to death. It can't meet the metabolic demands of excessive stimulation, and it just dies, tries to recycle itself. It's programmed to do that. Okay, a little more information about these synapses. We talked about the voltage-gated calcium channel here, letting calcium in and activating the glutamate neurotransmitter vesicle travel to the plasma membrane of the presynaptic neuron. Okay, releases its glutamate, binds to the AMPA receptor, then it binds to the NMDA receptor. When this depolarizes the cell, the magnesium pops out of the NMDA receptor. Another important point here is that cortisol, the corticosteroid, will come into the presynaptic neuron, and it'll also activate the release of more glutamate. Things it'll do that are stress, excessive psychological stress that's prolonged and chronic especially. Transient stress isn't as big a deal for seizure patients, but when it's chronic and prolonged, then it becomes a bigger deal. Caffeine contributes to this a little bit. Sleep deprivation contributes to this a lot. Okay. Now here is the rage reaction, the famous Netter rage reaction. And basically, when a person's pissed off, you're in the fight or flight, sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So there's SANS and PANS. SANS is sympathetic autonomic nervous system. PANS is parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. So SANS is fight or flight. PANS is rest and digest, or feed and breed. Okay, so there's always a competition for who's going to activate the hypothalamus. Okay, and the hypothalamus is sort of the control center of the body, like the center, the crossroads of the whole brain. And basically, when you're afraid and you're worried and you feel in danger, like a fight or flight situation, you activate sympathetic, okay, a stressed out feeling. Versus when you're happy and everything is peaceful and calm and beautiful and loving and stress-free, then you're in parasympathetic, okay? And you want to spend more of your life in parasympathetic. Most of us wish we could. All right, so anyways, that's going to activate different hormones and whatnot. This is the stress response. So catecholamines are going to go up, cortisol is going to go up, more glutamate's going to be sent across the synaptic cleft in your neurons, okay? And chronic stress increases your risk of excitotoxicity, and this can increase your risk of epilepsy, of having a seizure. Not so much epilepsy, but if you've got epilepsy, having a recurrent seizure. Okay, you get increased glutamate release in the hippocampus. That's a key thing that cortisol does. Also increases blood lipids and blood glucose, so it predisposes you to increased risk of diabetes. It also predisposes you to insomnia, unable to sleep because you're stressed out. That also increases your risk of recurrent seizure. So you don't want things that elevate cortisol if you're trying to prevent a seizure. Okay, a little more detail that you even have extrasynaptic receptors for glutamate, and these in particular are more prone to initiating excitotoxicity and overstimulation of the postsynaptic neuron, and they tend to be more likely to be activated if there's a problem clearing glutamate from the synaptic cleft. This is the astrocyte. So this has been called a three-part synapse or a tripartite synapse. There's the cell number 1, the presynaptic neuron, cell number 2, these are another neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, and then here's the supportive cell, the mama cell of the brain, and that is the astrocyte, and it takes up the glutamate from the synaptic cleft, converts it to glutamine, because you can send glutamine extracellular. You don't want glutamate extracellular because it could activate things. So you can send glutamine extracellular, and it goes back to the neuron, gets reconverted into glutamate. Okay, now here's just one additional thing. This is a GABA channel, and the GABA channel, it is sort of like turns the neuron off. Calcium entry turns the neuron on. Chloride makes its membrane potential more negative, so it shuts it down, makes it less likely to release its neurotransmitter. So GABA turns things off. You want to know that. Okay, that will come up later. All right, again, here's a little more detail about, synapse, that these are called SNMDA receptors. NMDAR, it's often abbreviated like that. These are synaptic. In general, they do good things. We need them for our memory and just normal thinking and responses. Extrasynaptic MDARs, in general, they cause problems. I mean, you need them there, but they can cause significant problems for you. Those are the ones that are more likely when glutamate is spilling out of the synaptic cleft. There's too much of it. It can activate these guys. So we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. And I will restart with part 2 in just a moment.